Okay, so I think we've just gone live on YouTube and Facebook, and welcome everyone. This is our second episode of the Meet the Scholar series. This is very exciting, and today we have a very special guest, Ed, and I will hand you over to Claire, our regular host, who will introduce Ed and tell us a little bit more about what to expect today.
Great, thanks. So, welcome to today's second episode. We're lucky to be joined by Ed Armston-Sheret, who's a PhD candidate funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, close to submission as well. So big news coming in the pipeline, hopefully in the next few months. So Ed's research examines the relationship between changing social and scientific understandings of the human body and cultures, conventions surrounding Victorian and Edwardian exploration. And his work has been published in numerous academic journals, including the Journal of Historical Geography, Geography Compass, the Victorian Review, and the Social History of Alcohol and Drugs. I think, Ed, also you've had been awarded with numerous fellowships to go and visit lots of libraries and archives, which I'm sure is amazing to be around all of those books. So hopefully, today's presentation, you're going to talk a bit more about, some of your research that sort of feeds into sort of discourses of alcohol from a historical perspective, and then we can sort of bring it up and compare it to sort of today's situation, and obviously take questions from the Club Soda audience who are watching live. Please feel free to put your comments underneath the video. They will come through to us as a chat, and then we will take Q&A at the end, if that's okay. So over to you, Ed.
Great. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'm just going to start by showing you all the image that sparked my interest in polar explorers and drinking. I was looking through the archive at a place called the Scott Polar Research Institute, which is part of the University of Cambridge. And you have this collection of photographs stowed away in their archive. And I stumbled across this one, and it is a picture of some explorers giving whiskey to a pony. And when I saw this image, it just sparked so many questions for me. I sort of thought, why on earth would they think this was a good idea? And what possible positive effects did they think giving whiskey to a pony would have? And this sort of set me off on a trail of research, both about this incident specifically, but also about attitudes towards drink in the Victorian and Edwardian era. And I'm going to, as Claire said, I'm going to talk a bit about these ideas about drink, but in the Victorian era, but I also want to talk about sort of how they shape our contemporary understandings of alcohol today. So the answer in this question, in this case, is that this horse had fallen into the sea and was very cold. And so the explorers were giving it some whiskey in the thought that it would help warm up the pony. And this changed my view about alcohol in a number of ways in terms of how Victorian and Edwardian people viewed it. Because before I looked at this image, I thought that lots of explorers who talked about drinking, and they do talk about drinking quite a lot, were doing so just maybe as a sort of, maybe they talked about it as a medicinal drink, just as an excuse maybe to justify, more social or psychological uses of drinking. But seeing them give it to a pony in this way made me think maybe they did genuinely believe that alcohol might have some positive effects. So this set me off on a trail of research about attitudes to drink in the Victorian and Edwardian era. And I suppose that any discussion of drink in the Victorian era has to start with the Temperance Movement. And the Temperance Movement is this, big social movement in the Victorian era that changes attitudes towards drink. So if you go back hundreds and hundreds of years, alcohol, drinks like beer were often considered like a normal part of diet. They were food rather than something very different from a very different drink that you would only take at specific times and specific places. So this means that alcohol is undergoes a real change in the Victorian era, where like the temperance campaigners, with their origins in sort of working class evangelical Christianity, questioned the idea that drink should be a normal part of diet. And there were big campaigns against drink specifically, but also against alcoholism. And you can see a quote here from a man called William Carpenter, who was a medic. He basically advocated from a medical perspective that alcohol was basically always harmful. And he says, all are agreed as to the baneful influence upon health and morals resulting from excessive use of alcoholic drinks. So by the 1870s, attitudes towards drink within British society had changed, both amongst people who were part of the temperance movement, but also amongst society more broadly, because if you have some people who aren't drinking altogether, even those who continued drinking had to talk about it in quite different ways. You know, it wasn't just normal, it was something that was debatable. And you can see a great example of some sort of temperance propaganda on the screen as well. But the strange thing about all of this was that the use of alcohol as a medicine actually increased in the Victorian era. At the same time as attitudes towards drink in general were changing. But why did this happen? Well, the answer is in making alcohol sort of a special substance, either a poison, sometimes a poison, it could also make it into a medicine. If it had special powers, then perhaps these special powers could be used for good as well as evil. So it's gone from being a food to something very different. And as prescriptions of alcohol therefore increase, and people use it as a medicine, often mixed with other things. Sometimes these were sort of tonics like quinine, which goes to the origin of drinks like gin and tonic, although the history of that's a bit more complex than most people realize. But the other thing that then happens is that people start using alcohol as a medicine. And this leads to a sort of divide within medicine over how people should drink. Some people thought it was always best to avoid drinking. Some people thought maybe drinking in moderation was okay. And other people sort of didn't advocate much drinking in general, but thought that maybe specially prescribed medicinal alcohol might be useful for some diseases. This didn't go sort of unnoticed at the time. And as you can see on your screen, there's a sort of cartoon of people in a doctor's office and they look like they're very drunk and having a good time. And I think the subtext of this cartoon is that people are getting prescribed alcohol, you know, for medicinal uses, but it's just actually an excuse for drunkenness. So this is sort of the context, and I'm now going to go and move on to talk about how some explorers used alcohol on their expeditions. There's a few different names and a few different expeditions to different areas. You don't need to worry too much about understanding all the intricacies of that, because I'm really interested in talking about them for what they tell us about attitudes towards drink in the Victorian era. And the first one of these expeditions is one called the National Arctic Expedition. And this tried to go to the North Pole in 1875 and 1876 on board two naval ships. And they thought that if they could sail far enough north, they might get to an open polar sea, which would allow them to sail all the way to the North Pole. Obviously, this turned out not to be true, and they got stuck in the ice. And then they tried to go over the ice by foot to reach the North Pole. But what the interesting thing is, because it was a naval expedition, they took a lot of rum with them to the Arctic. So rum was an ordinary part of naval rations until the middle of the 20th century. And so in the Navy, you'd normally have it a midday tot of rum. But on this expedition, when they were sledging, they continued to drink, but they did so differently. And the quote sums up quite nicely how they used alcohol. It says, "Our custom was, after tenting at night, to have our tea, then our pemmican, which is the food they ate, and then the allowance of rum. The rum and the tobacco together had, I consider, a most cheering and salutary effect on my sledge crew." So The interesting thing here is that alcohol is used sort of at the end of the day to help the explorers relax and go to sleep. And other people on the expedition also talk about the warming effects of alcohol. So these ideas about alcohol being something that people drink at the end of a stressful and hard bit of work are obviously still quite prevalent today, as is the idea that alcohol, makes you feel warmer. But even in the Victorian times, people knew this wasn't true. And the problems for this expedition emerged when there was an outbreak of a disease called scurvy, which is caused by a lack of vitamin C. And it has all these horrible effects on the body. So your gums will go black, your teeth might even start to fall out. You get strange and horrible bruises in places across your body. But because of this, the explorers had to turn back early. And when they get home, people are shocked and surprised that this, great heroic naval expedition has had to turn back after basically just 1 year in the Arctic. They'd planned to be there much longer. And they start searching for a reason. Why have the explorers' bodies failed in this way? And this was obviously particularly troubling in the Victorian era because there were lots of racist ideas about at the time about sort of civilization and progress. And obviously lots of Inuit people live in the Arctic very successfully with much less technology than these explorers had. So it provokes a real crisis of confidence in naval exploration. And quite quickly, public attention turns to the way the explorers had drank on the expedition. And there was this huge public inquiry into the issue. And this is on the screen, you can see some evidence that was given at the inquiry. Alcohol acts to a certain extent in lowering the temperature of the body. I would certainly put it last in the articles of diet. And there were even a few sort of stories put forward by abstinence societies in Britain that said that, individual explorers who had avoided drinking had managed to avoid the outbreak of scurvy. So this leads to this huge public inquiry and debate. And at the end of it, the Admiralty concludes that the people who suffered worse from scurvy on the expedition had been alcoholics. And it said that, the explorers would be much better off drinking tea or a drink like Bovril instead of rum to warm themselves up. So this is a real blow to the idea that alcohol, is warming and relaxing. And it's now considered, perhaps a poison in the polar regions. But there is a class dimension to this too. And the people that the Admiralty accused of being alcoholics were working class sailors rather than officers. And I think this shows how, practices of drinking, what was considered acceptable and unacceptable, were also shaped by who you were as well as how much you drank. So I think after this, alcohol goes very much out of fashion in polar exploration. But this idea that alcohol maybe makes you feel warm, helps you relax at the end of a difficult day, is still quite prevalent in certain circles today. And it's, if you listen to people talking about why they drink, it's still important. But the idea that alcohol was a useful supply wasn't just confined to the polar regions. In the tropics too, explorers drank. And this is a quote from a book called Hints to Travellers, which is basically the how-to guide onto how to be an explorer in the Victorian era. And the writer gives these medical hints, he calls them, on how to travel successfully. And he says, the writer himself, practically a teetotaler at home, has experienced abroad the benefit of using alcohol in moderation when traveling and collecting in tropical parts of the 3 great continents. So again, if the book more widely sort of talks about alcohol again being useful when you're sort of had a really strange, stressful day in the tropics, and the effects of tropical diseases maybe were felt on your body and also on your mind. So other explorers also supported this idea. Mary Kingsley, who is a fascinating figure, who was one of the first women explorers of Africa, was in favour of certain forms of medicinal drinking. She says all the evidence is in favour of alcohol of a proper sort, taken at proper times and in proper quantities, being extremely valuable. And she even, has this evidence that missionaries who go out to the tropics, tropical West Africa, die more quickly of fever and other diseases if they didn't drink. But the point about Mary King's these ideas and this properness of drinking, again, shows the importance of identity in how alcohol consumption is viewed. So Mary Kingsley, while she advocated medicinal drinking for white explorers, she often wrote in very racist terms about the way Africans drank, even if the actual amount of alcohol consumed wasn't necessarily very different. And I think this shows how this discourse of properness and sobriety in medicine was a very important part of Victorian medicine, but it was also very loaded with Victorian ideas about race, racism, and identity. But it also caused problems. So in advocating that travellers, explorers, and missionaries could drink, this sort of advice created the perception in certain parts of the population, and the media, that lots of people were going to the tropics to drink excessively, and actually that this was having bad effects on the health of both travellers and people in the tropics. And this man, Sir Harry Johnston, who was a explorer, colonial administrator, he was involved in setting up London Zoo, became particularly concerned about this, the way people were drinking in the tropics. He wrote a series of advice for travellers and explorers in his book, The River Congo, which he published in 1895. And he sort of was concerned that travellers were using this idea that alcohol might help you to relax and protect you from some of the effects of the tropical environment. And he thought that people were using this as an excuse to drink excessively. And his advice to travellers was to take more books, less brandy. And I think the interesting thing about Sir Harry Johnston is, while he is concerned about the way people drank, he himself still can't quite separate himself from the idea that alcohol in certain circumstances might have beneficial effects. And he says, avoid alcohol as much as you can. It is almost a case when abstention is excusable. On the other hand, alcohol is simply invaluable as a tonic when weak from fever or other causes. And I think the interesting point to compare here with, say, Mary Kingsley's writings or the advice in Hints to Travellers is that whereas they were advocating alcohol sort of as a preventative, he says it might be a medicine when you're ill. And I think these go to the heart of quite different ideas about what alcohol is useful for. So maybe there's this idea that alcohol sort of helps you recover from the stress of tropical travel, but also perhaps that certain forms of alcohol might be strength building. And I think his comments about brandy are also particularly interesting, because as Mary Kingsley's quote also illustrates, all alcohol wasn't viewed equally. Alcoholic drinks like brandy were seen as having more medicinal effects than other drinks like beer. Champagne might have been viewed as particularly medicinal by some people. So there is this sort of hierarchy about what alcohol is medicinal and which alcohol is poison, that again shows how these questions of identity, class, status play a really important role in shaping attitudes towards drink. So if alcohol was being, so if by the sort of latter part of the Victorian era, by the 1890s, alcohol is being viewed as less and less useful in both the tropical regions and in the Antarctic, then it's hardly surprising that you get the emergence of explorers whose sobriety is celebrated as a way to sort of emphasize their heroism. And I think one of the great examples of this is a man called William Lashley, who was an Antarctic explorer in the Edwardian era. So he goes to Antarctica twice with Captain Scott, who famously dies on his way back from the South Pole in 1912. And William Lashley plays a really important role in this expedition. He pulls loads of supplies towards the South Pole with Scott, and he saves the life, along with another man, of an officer who again suffers with scurvy. So the history of polar exploration is full of these tales of scurvy. And Captain Scott writes very positively about William Lashley in one of his books. He said he'd been a teetotaler and a non-smoker all his life and was never in anything but the hardest condition. And you can sort of see from this image that William Lashley was an incredibly strong man who was a stoker in the Royal Navy, so shoveling coal into the engines of into the boilers of ships. And obviously his physical hardiness is linked to his sobriety and his abstention, which is a real shift from what we saw earlier in some of those earlier Arctic voyages, where alcohol was something that, explorers saw as having beneficial effects on their physical and mental health. Now sobriety is the thing that might protect you and make you a great explorer. And you sort of get exactly the same advice coming about amongst given to tropical travelers. This is again the same book I talked about earlier, Hints to Travelers. It was republished several times with new edition, which reflected like the changing medical advice given to explorers. And by 1906, the advice had changed considerably from what it was in 1883. In 1883, it says that alcohol might be useful in certain circumstances. By 1906, it says excess in the use of alcoholic stimulants is one of the most fatal errors into which a tropic resident can fall, and its use as a beverage is totally unnecessary. Tea, coffee, and cocoa being the best beverages for ordinary use. So alcohol has gone from being, something positive, something helpful on the body of the traveller and explorer, to something that is not just a danger, but is one of the most fatal errors they can succumb to. And why has there been such a shift? And I think there's a number of reasons for this. I mean, one is changing scientific understandings of alcohol. There is a sort of a growing awareness about the links between alcohol and other diseases, and growing research on the effects of alcohol on the body. But it's also linked to the question of empire. In 1883, European empires in Africa were much smaller, confined to the coast, and people didn't spend as long there. By 1906, you've had a thing called the Scramble for Africa, which is where European powers, divide up the African continent between them. And one of the effects of this is people is that there are growing numbers of white Europeans traveling to Africa and staying there for longer periods of time as colonial administrators. And obviously, if you advise those people to drink medicinally, alcoholism is going to be the result. So it's partially scientific understanding, but it's partially a product of like these broader political changes which change how long people from Britain are staying in the tropics. I think the second thing that's really interesting about this quote is that alcohol was being replaced with other drugs. You know, Hints to Travellers isn't just advising explorers to drink water. It's advising them to drink tea, coffee, and cocoa, which all have, you know, various substances in them, particularly caffeine, that have effects on the body. And I think this was something that struck me as very interesting. I mean, obviously, there's a safety dimension to this in that all these drinks are boiled, which obviously means they're less likely to carry germs. And so boiling water becomes a way of rendering it safe. But it also makes me wonder the degree to which, you know, in shifting away from drinking alcohol, people, you know, move on to slightly different forms of drugs, which obviously have very different effects in terms of harm and things like that. But, you know, to what degree do we move? Does the 19th century see the replacement of alcohol with caffeine as the socially acceptable drug for mass consumption? And I think this personally fascinated me in terms of my own efforts to drink less. I mean, I remember sometimes, you know, if you go out with your friends for a night out and if you're not drinking, there's been periods, you know, where I have, you know, 4 or 5 pints of Diet Coke or something. And that often leaves you feeling very weird in other ways, all that caffeine surging through your system. And I think the overall sort of issues I think that looking at explorers allow us to see is how issues of temperature and climate are really important in terms of how we drink. Do we drink more? Do people drink more when it's warm or cold? And, you know, to what degree is alcohol used for sort of coping with these changes in temperature? You know, these myths that alcohol warms you up or relaxes you still are very powerful. And I think the second problem is the problem of moderation, which keeps cropping up in lots of explorers' accounts. Lots of the earlier advice, we were talking about proper sorts of alcohol taken in the proper ways. So that's separating a sort of very moderate and medicinal use of alcohol from drunkenness and excessive drinking. And I think the problem that the Victorian explorers kept encountering was that in advocating moderation, this proved very hard to implement in practice. And, you know, it often led to concerns that people were drinking too much and in the wrong kinds of ways. So I think that's something that remains a very important question in discussions, you know, about drink and sobriety is, you know, the challenges of managing a moderate consumption of alcohol. And I think the final thing is the question of identity, you know, who drinks, where, and in what ways, all shaped by, you know, how broader social understandings of drinking. And I think some of the earlier discussions about polar expeditions show how, you know, class was a dimension of that. And obviously racism also shaped how people wrote, especially explorers wrote about these issues, remain very important and alive today. So I think I'm going to leave it there for now and look forward to hearing all your questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ed. Fabulous. So, you know, I had a few thoughts that I wanted to sort of pick up on, and then, you know, we'll see what comes in. You know, first of all, I thought, well, thank you very much. Obviously, it was very informative. Something that, you know, strikes me from what you were talking about was this concept of almost like a moral panic, where people were, well, this perception that obviously people were going abroad and traveling in order to drink, almost like this sort of historical when in Vegas type scenario. But, you know, at that time, there weren't that many people who had access to travel. And so to what extent was that, do you think, sort of this sort of outblown moral propaganda, a bit like we see, you know, in the Daily Mail now, as like, you know, photos of binge drinking and people falling about on the streets. And yes, it does go on, but is it is it representative of the total population? So I think that was just something that I wanted to pick up on. If you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it goes to the heart of one of the challenges of researching alcohol use historically, is that as now, if people's writings about alcohol and their drinking habits aren't always 100% accurate, especially if they go into published books. So it's really hard to work out to the degree to which these problems are real and the degree to which they were sort of part of a moral panic. I mean, in some senses, I found, at least in some explorers' accounts, the opposite, where in public they say, "Oh, I didn't drink very much at all," but in private they, talk about having a terrible hangover and stuff like that. So it's a really difficult question to answer in terms of how widespread it actually was. But I think sorry.
There you go.
But I think as more people travel overseas, these concerns become more widespread. I suppose that's the point. And I think maybe that's also where, if it's a few people going on a few expeditions, maybe it's not so much of a problem. But as more people travel with, the expansion of the British Empire, it becomes a much bigger issue.
Yeah, I agree. I think as it progresses through sort of the late 1800s into early 1900s, I think probably more people are emigrating for work, and especially, one of the themes I wanted to talk about also was women, because, there were a lot of male explorers in your presentation. I know Mary Kingsley was sort of a pioneer from a female perspective, but obviously there was sort of Isabella Bird and Mariana North, and I think there's this dynamic of, if they're traveling, not necessarily just about alcohol, but also things, about issues of sexuality and what they're wearing, that they often sort of communicated one thing at home and then performed another thing abroad. And so what sort of issues of propriety from a female perspective did you find when you were sort of doing your research? I think that's still sort of relevant as well today.
So the person I've looked at in most detail is Isabella Bird, who is this really important Victorian traveller and geographer, and she's a fascinating figure in terms of her attitudes towards drink. So she publicly spoke at several temperance meetings advocating reductions in alcohol use, but she herself used medicine. She had a spinal condition that made it very difficult for her to move around, and she was often in a lot of pain, and she used alcohol as a medicine herself. And she writes to the organizers of one of these events she's speaking at, saying, "Well, I would like to speak at your meeting, but I'm not in favor of total abstinence. Maybe some moderate consumption is okay. I have a glass of wine with my dinner. Is that okay?" And so I think that there is that question about propriety. I think the temperance movement becomes a way for lots of women to become politically active on a cause in the 19th century, to speak at public meetings in ways that perhaps they weren't able to do in other areas. But there's also, I think, particular constraints about women's drinking in terms of how they wrote about it in public. So they even more than men were much more likely to downplay how much they drank, I think.
Yeah, and that sort of stigma and shaming around how much women are drinking, is obviously still very much part of the gendered sort of lens that we view drinking today. You just mentioned about sort of the temperance movement and the different views there. Something I wanted to draw out was this concept of moderation versus total abstinence, and the temperance movement moved through different sort of strategies on what they promoted and what they didn't. But ironically, you know, even today we still don't have sort of a medical definition of what is moderation or what is an appropriate level, really, apart from a unit amount, which isn't necessarily 100% validated by scientific evidence. So what could you speak more about that sort of temperance negotiation between sort of moderation versus total abstinence?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the thing to understand is that I suppose at the start of the 19th century, temperance means something quite different than it does by the end. So, you know, temperance initially meant, you know, avoiding drunkenness, based on quite a religious sort of, if you look at sort of the Catholic and Anglican writings about temperance, historically it was, you know, temperance was avoiding drunkenness. But the temperance movement by the 1830s and 1840s, you know, it becomes increasingly radical and is advocating total abstinence rather than just avoiding drunkenness. And so the initial temperance movements really focus on the question of spirits. There's always panic about, you know, gin a bit earlier. So it does change, but by the end of the Victorian era, you know, temperance means abstinence in a lot of contexts.
And do you think there was a change in what it meant due to the difference in the kind of people that got involved with the temperance movement? I'm just thinking in terms of the sort of class of individuals, because it sort of originally was, I feel, from my understanding, and I'm not sure if this is a total comprehensive understanding, is that sort of it was more middle class viewing that actually they could be more civilized and lift themselves up socially if they engaged in abstinence and reduced their drinking. I'll put abstinence in inverted commas there because I don't think they necessarily thought it was total abstinence. And then sort of the movement got sort of filled from a ranks perspective with the sort of working class evangelicals, and whether there was whether that dictated the change in what they viewed to be appropriate levels of drinking or moderation and total abstinence.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I sort of, in terms of my research, I think one of the things I've found interesting about this is I think a lot of the interesting debates also happen in medicine, changing medical understandings of alcohol and whether moderate consumption is acceptable. And I think William Carpenter's book that I mentioned briefly in my presentation was really important in he wasn't actually in the temperance movement, although I think his parents were, but he sort of says basically alcohol is not good for you in any circumstances. So I think, and then over the 19th century, you know, I think sort of people like medics increasingly use discussions of temperance as a way to have greater sort of social power. So I think you're right. I think there's definitely a class dimension in terms of how advocating abstinence, the abstinence of others, gives you can give you a certain power. But I think also the turn towards abstinence in the earlier period was also driven by sort of there was an element of real working class radicalism in there as well, where people, you know, like start these evangelical meetings and people then just sort of like saying, you know, I'm going to give up alcohol, take the teetotal pledge and become an abstainer. So it wasn't just a top-down thing, particularly in the earlier period. And I think as the temperance societies get more established, I think the leadership becomes more middle class.
Okay, so when we think of the drinks that particularly fueled that discussion, and something that comes to mind is obviously gin and gin lane. You know, that was very much fueled, from my understanding, of the panic around women's, especially working class women's, consumption of alcohol, which is slightly ironic because we flip it to today and actually gin is sort of seen as more of a middle class sort of woman's gin and tonic cocktail, or, you know, and so on, and quite feminized. You know, from a class perspective, although temperance was heavily sort of engaged, in those class dynamics, prior to that sort of, at the point where your research sort of connects, I guess, in the Victorian era, do you think that's when sort of the class dynamic really sort of embedded, or was it always a factor earlier on?
Yeah, I'm not sure so much about an earlier period, but I think I suppose what I found interesting about the class dynamic in some of these expeditions is how it's very contested. So I think the example of the National Arctic expedition I gave, there is really a class dynamic in terms of the people who are labelled alcoholics who had scurvy. And I think this goes back to the sort of drink they were drinking. So rum is a sailor's drink. It's not considered a medicinal one like maybe brandy would be. Rum's, it's a sailor's drink, and it's not good for you. But I think the other interesting thing about it is many of the people who were abstainers were also working class. So I think you actually see a really interesting, like William Lashley was, a naval stoker. So you can really see that class dimension in terms of it's both discussions of alcohol can be a means to sort of discipline working class people, but they can also be a form of working class sort of self-expression and sort of empowerment in terms of being like, I'm giving up alcohol and look how much better this made my life. And
yeah, this sort of self-improvement sort of discourse. And I also think there is an element of, even today, whether you could choose that path as a form of lifting yourself up above your peers and a sense of othering of, I'm fully abstinent, whereas you're only moderating, and that sort of inter-class dynamic rather than just between the classes. I think that really makes, it provides that nuance rather than just seeing it as a binary of, middle class and working class.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in that sense, the discussion around, like criticizing this expedition for the way it had used alcohol, because it's a naval expedition. This is an expedition organised by the Royal Navy at basically the height of the British Empire, and it goes wrong. And so then highlighting how this is mismanagement in terms of the way they've used alcohol is quite a powerful sort of anti-establishment critique. It's being like, look, this great institution can't even look after the bodies of these sailors, and is the way they're using alcohol one of the causes of that?
Yeah, and I guess then people sort of questioning the sort of patriarchal advice and control and supply around alcohol at that time, which was more government intervention than there is today, I guess. Just trying to think of how that would play out. I wanted to touch just quickly upon, you use the phrase, alcoholic, and I think that may be a direct quote from, the things that you've read. Obviously, in that time period, we saw the rise of sort of the disease model, if you like, and it was further fueled sort of in the 1930s, so a bit later on from maybe what you're looking at. But how did they use that term or qualify it? Today we still don't really have a proper understanding of, what defines somebody as an alcoholic, but what did it mean to them back then, or was it fairly unknown? I
think the exact word is some wording they use is something addicted to the immoderate use of alcoholic spirits or stimulants or something like that. And so it's that element of, I think, of addiction, I think, that makes that I think, you can really see that sort of changing understanding. And I suppose that's I think one of the dimensions that comes out of this is the degree to which, when you hear, say, Mary Kingsley talk about alcohol of a proper sort at proper times and in proper quantities, it's very disciplined. I drink when it is right to do so in the right amount in this very specific way, and I'm in control of it. Whereas I suppose if the counterpoint to that is the idea of addiction, which is that you're, I suppose,
You have
not
no
in control.
yeah.
And I think that's probably one of the main dimensions that comes out of it.
Yeah, I think again, I haven't researched it as much as you have, but just looking at that sort of time and discourse and the way it was used, I think, if somebody wanted to do some further research, I think it's The Politics of Alcohol, isn't it, by James Nichols, which is a good synopsis of sort of past into sort of present day and how it sort of informed the discourse going forward. Was the concept of addiction to these sort of stimulants, if you like, and substances also used regarding coffee and caffeine, when we're thinking, because that was obviously the alternative that they gave people? Did they understand at that point?
I've never seen any reference to addiction in terms of those substances, and that's I think what fascinated me about it. And then it comes up in quite a lot of the, I only use one quote, but if you go through the archives, there's loads of stuff in this medical advice, and it really changes where they're sort of saying, like, don't drink alcohol, drink tea, drink coffee. And it makes, and if you think about how widespread tea is or coffee as a drinks within Britain now, it makes you realize that that sort of use of tea so habitually is a product of some of these debates, I think. And it's sort of, and I suppose that's what fascinates me, is that they really don't advocate water. I mean, partially I think because there's this risk you don't boil it, but they do advocate caffeine, but they don't see it as a drug in any way. At least I haven't found much reference to it. And
no, I guess whether there's also this dynamic of trade and government earnings off the back of sort of empire and the flow of goods, and obviously where if they're not going to earn their money through the duty on alcohol, are they going to sort of gain from pushing tea and coffee upon sort of the subjects of the empire instead? I think definitely there's, even today we could look at why the government policy is the way it is around alcohol, and how much they earn versus the costs, and so you can see that sort of dynamic playing out in terms of what they offer as an alternative at that time.
Yeah, and it's certainly shaped by, I think you're right, like by the globalization of trade, really. I suppose if you go back before this period, like lots of people drank beer as one of their most regular drinks, and then obviously the replacement of that with tea is hugely connected to empire and expansion of trade and things like that. So it's certainly linked, like a product of these broader changes, rather than just being an inevitable if you don't.
Do you think there is a class dynamic between sort of tea consumption and beer consumption? I'm just trying to think of this concept of sort of afternoon tea versus beer and how they would have been consumed.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, lots of the medical writings I've read, they really don't, except for one or two people who advocate porter, stout, porter or stout as a sort of medicinal strength building drink. In general, beer is really looked down on, but in medical literature on, whether or not you should drink on expeditions. They say brandy, yes, that's okay. Maybe some claret, that's fine. Whiskey, maybe, but beer is not very good at all. And I think there is definitely a class dimension to that.
And is the beer dynamic, that shift from beer to say port or claret, tied with that shift between food and medicine? Because beer to me sounds like it could be used as a carbohydrate substitute. Was that sort of part of the shift away from beer? How did it sort of work out?
Yeah, I think it's a sort of fascinating topic that I actually think I'd like to research a bit more. I think in terms of the way explorers write about it, I think, yeah, like beer is, I think people often talk about beer and the effects of it on your liver. They sort of say that beer has some bad effects, it makes you sort of bilious, they call it. Whereas like other forms of alcohol, they don't in some way. But I think you're right. I think there is beer, you know, obviously is very calorie heavy compared with lots of other drinks because it was basically a food. So I suppose it also goes back more broadly. I guess it goes back to the availability of food and food storage technologies and things like that. And I suppose the degree to which, you know, alcohol was used historically as preservative is part of this whole story as well. You know, at one stage, you know, it is a way of preserving food, destroying microbes and things like that. But as you go through the Victorian era, you get more the development of different technologies and different ways of preserving food. You know, you've got canning technology, which comes about in the Victorian era. And that means that maybe you don't need these other older ways of...
I also think, you know, if you're thinking from an explorer perspective, obviously it's a lot less economical to pile loads of barrels of beer onto a ship compared to, you know, bottles of higher strength spirits, if you want to call them that. I've got sort of one last thing that I want to touch upon, and that was this concept of relaxation and stressful, because I think, you know, based on a presentation that we had from Dr. Abby Rose in January, we were talking around the ways in which particularly women use alcohol in the current day as a coping strategy to relax after a day of perhaps childcare and work and so on. Obviously, the discourse, as you were saying, sort of changed where they realised that alcohol was not warming. But it seemed like that concept of relaxation and dealing with stress, alcohol as a way of dealing with stress, has sort of prevailed. How did it continue through sort of the sources that you've been looking at?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that really comes through lots of them is this constant sort of refrain, you know, where they talk about the sort of tenseness that they'll feel both in the Arctic and in the tropics, you know, after a day of hard traveling. They'll say, you know, like when you've got this sort of tense nervous system or like tense muscles, you know, alcohol helps you to relax. And I think there's also a psychological dimension to that, where people are out of their comfort zones. If you think about it, you know, these are people going to new places that they've never been to before, maybe encountering people they've never met before. You know, if you think about the situations where people drink in now, they're not necessarily that different. You know, people often think of alcohol as like a sort of, you know, a way to get rid of their social...
Yeah.
And there's a great book actually by a guy called Johannes Fabian. He writes about explorers from like an ethnographic point of view, and he looks at like explorers of Africa and their sort of anthropological work, and he talks about how alcohol becomes a way to sort of break down some of the barriers in some of these like first contact situations. You know, people meet people they've never met before, and therefore, you know,
hand them a glass of suspicious substance.
Exactly. And so in many ways, I think it's one of the things that really actually is quite similar to contemporary understandings, is this idea of, like a drink as a way to relax. But I think the problem is that then I mean, and I suppose it's exactly the same problem that people encounter now, which is where I think the change in attitudes comes about, is because that's okay, maybe if you do it once or twice, but if you're sending people to the tropics for much longer and they're constantly needing to relax, then maybe it's not really a very sustainable solution.
No, sort of like sent them on their way into a highly stressful situation and given them sort of one coping mechanism in which to deal with that. Obviously, it's a lot different today. If you were to travel abroad, you'd be able to, Zoom call everybody. No, I appreciate your time for giving that presentation. It was really fascinating. I think there are so many parallels between, you know, the Victorian era, particularly that era where sort of discourses really do start to change from a medical perspective and socially, religiously as well. So we've really been able to draw out a lot of those key themes. So I appreciate you taking the time, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's been great to speak to you. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks very much.